This story is about making private capital flow. Attracting international private capital for climate investment has been extremely difficult for developing countries. Investors believe that projects in these countries would be high-risk investments. It is still much more expensive to borrow money to invest in clean energy in most developing countries than it is in Europe or in the United States. For example, the same project in Germany will require 8% in equity returns compared to in Zambia, which will require 51% in returns. The World Bank and other development finance institutions have instruments that absorb some of the initial risks from projects by providing guarantees. But there's not enough public resources to de-risk $700 billion of private capital needed per year by 2035. Among developing countries, India is a critical outlier, having attracted significant private capital for clean energy investments in recent years. To help us understand what's going on there, let's go to Bangalore and meet Pawan Mulukutla from WRI India.
Every country faces challenge in attracting climate finance. Here in India, we know public finance isn't enough to meet the climate finance needs of $100 billion each year. We also need private capital. And there has been a lot of hard work to create a more welcoming environment for private capital that is now paying dividend, meaning more money for new facilities such as the solar array of Kempegowda International Airport here in Bengaluru. First of all, the government is setting ambitious targets indicating to the private sector they are serious about making the switch and that India is a market worth investing in. They have set out clear goals and sectoral targets. India's National Electricity Plan aims at achieving 500 gigawatt of clean energy by 2030 and 600 by 2032. There is also a target for states to reach 43% share of renewable electricity by 2030. But they haven't just set goals. They also have a strategic roadmap for how they will support the shift towards clean energy through a series of nudges from India's policy makers. This provides investors with the predictable incentives that give them the confidence they need. The government has also signaled support for greening the economy through budgetary allocations and subsidies in both existing and new areas. This is also aimed at building investor confidence and building momentum alongside the national government's ratcheting up of ambition. When it works, it's not the government that has to put in the money. Instead, it makes it easier and more profitable for private capital to invest in India's transition. Third, government at both national and state level has made it clear that the transition to clean energy is all about competitive advantage, about building strong and prosperous economies for the future. Here in India, we are seeing progress in how a country can attract more private climate finance, but it needs to build upon its successes to bring the money needed. But the example of India shows us what can be done to make the engine of private climate finance work so much more effective, and that's a key part of our story to watch for 2025.
That was Pawan Mulukutla, WRI India's Executive Director for Integrated Transportation, Clean Air, Hydrogen. Of course, India has advantages, including its growing economy, its deep pools of domestic private capital, and the size of its internal market. But there are few things that India did that all developing countries need to do to attract international private finance. As Pawan noted, India started by setting clear sectoral targets, which should be connected to each country's NDCs. Then, India put in place supportive national and state-level policies to nudge private sector. In addition, the government and the domestic banks introduced new instruments to enable sustainable financing to flow more freely and more efficiently. Critically, the government of India has significantly ramped up its investment of public capital in the sector. Between 2004 and 2014, the government spent less than $700 million. However, in 2024 alone, the government budget for the sector increased to $2.4 billion, growing the confidence of private investors. Most importantly, we see how some of the missing private finance in the $1.3 trillion needed can be mobilized with policies and targeted use of public capital. Public-private partnership will be the key to de-risk and attract sufficient private capital. We have seen effective examples of this holistic approach from China's Green Industrial Policy and the United States Inflation Reduction Act. While few countries will have this kind of firepower at their disposal, the lesson about setting clear ambition and backing it with strong public policy and public finance is relevant everywhere. For example, in 2019, the African Development Bank loaned funds to Morocco to support coordinated domestic climate policies. By 2021, this funding offered guarantees to nearly 50,000 medium and small enterprises, supported 1,100 projects led by women, and helped realize approximately $300 million in private equity investment. So, what should we watch for this year? First, keep an eye out for country platforms. These are country-driven initiatives to bring different pieces of public and private capital together behind priority investment. For example, Colombia just launched its country platform. We'll be watching how many new ones are launched, how the existing platforms get underway, and whether they enable countries to rapidly scale up private investment in climate action. Second, following the recent US election, 6 banks pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Will backlash against ESG initiatives slow climate investments? Or will net zero transition plans and increasing risk disclosures in Europe, Japan, and other countries continue to drive green investments? Third, credit rating agencies have been criticized for overestimating the risk of investment in developing countries. Will leaders at the Finance for Development Conference agree to evaluate this risk differently? Fourth, the annual Finance in Common Summit in Cape Town will bring together 500 public development banks, representing $23 trillion in assets. As we saw in India, public development banks can act as a critical bridge for climate-related investment within countries. Will all banks embrace this as a central mission? With international private capital expected to fill half of the $1.3 trillion in climate finance needs by 2035, countries must work together to drastically scale up international flows.